Hi, everyone, and welcome to Get Hired Live. I'm your host, Andrew Seaman, the LinkedIn Senior News Editor for Job Searches and Careers. I'm so happy you're joining us today. We have these conversations every Friday, and I always think people get a lot out of them. So I'm so happy you're here to learn from our wonderful experts that we have joining us on these days. So I want to start off by always asking you to introduce yourself in the comments. I see a lot of you doing that already. We have Dolores from Dallas, Mohammed from India, Malik from Pakistan, Yolanda from Palm Beach, Florida. I'm sure it's lovely there right now. And we have Martin from Connecticut, Ash from Washington State, and Ademo from Nigeria. So we have people from all over the world joining us. So keep introducing yourself and don't just tell us where you're from. Tell us a little bit about your job search and your career. So maybe you're looking to level up in your career, you want to get a promotion, maybe you're looking to move into a new industry or a new field. Tell us a little bit about that. And then what I want you to do is pay attention to the other people who are in the stream, and maybe they're in the same region as you, maybe they're looking to move into the same industry as you, and you can network with each other and help each other out. Maybe you have job leads that they might need, maybe they have job leads that you might need. So just keep networking with each other. It's the foundation of a successful job search and really a great career. And there's no better time to start than right now. And then, of course, I want you to send us all of your questions about job searching and career advancement, because we have such a wonderful expert joining us today. And I want to bring him onto the screen right now, Dr. Richard Orbay Austin. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
Well, I'm so excited to have you here because you are a psychologist and you are also an executive coach, and you are the co-author of a book about overcoming imposter syndrome. And I think that's been such a hot topic right now because I think a lot of people, they feel it, and then I don't think the pandemic has probably helped. So can you tell us a little bit about what imposter syndrome is?
Sure. And I am so thrilled to be able to talk about this topic because, as you said, it's a hot topic, but there's some myths that have been going about, unfortunately, in the popular media. So let's talk a little bit about what actually imposter syndrome is. Imposter syndrome was coined about 40 years ago by two psychologists, Clance and Imes, that talks about this phenomena where you have difficulty internalizing your accomplishments, constantly feel like you're going to be exposed as a fraud, and attribute any of your successes to luck or to a key relationship. And so when we're talking about imposter syndrome, we're not saying that you are an imposter. Oftentimes, some of the myths that we see recently. So someone tells you you have imposter syndrome, they're not saying, oh, you're an imposter. They're saying you're a high achieving person who is having difficulty really owning their strengths, their skills, and all their wonderful gifts.
Yeah. And, you know, and I know you, in your book, you have a lot of examples and a lot of exercises. And just so I make sure I mention it, your book is Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life. Because what more could you want? But, you know, for a person who is maybe struggling to get ahead, or they're really struggling at work or in other areas of their lives, how do they know it's imposter syndrome? Because obviously there's a lot of things going on right now, and they may not be able to say, okay, maybe this is imposter syndrome, or maybe it's not. So how can a person say, okay, I think this might be what I'm actually struggling with?
Sure. I think it's a great question, because sometimes people will say, well, maybe I just have low self-confidence. And when we're talking about imposter syndrome, some of the typical ways that it manifests is through overwork, through perfectionism. So you overwork because you feel like that's the only way to prove that you belong, that you deserve the job that you are seeking. So these are some of the things that are so crucial and critical when we're trying to really talk through what it is that someone is experiencing in that dynamic. So it's more than just low self-confidence. It's this constant feeling and constant thought of, I'm going to be exposed as a fraud. I don't really believe, I belong in this job. People don't think that I'm smart enough. People don't feel like I can actually fit in. And I need to work above and beyond at all times to show that I deserve to be here.
Yeah, and I think the topic is resonating with a lot of people. I see Marie Claude in the comments saying, this is an awesome topic. And then, we have just so many people joining us. Just a quick shout out to Terry from Charleston, South Carolina, Eduardo from Chicago, Dimitris from Athens, Greece, and Mead from Brookline, New Hampshire. So welcome to all of you. And a lot of people here are probably looking for work, or they're getting ready to go on a job search in their career. And with imposter syndrome, how can it affect a job seeker? Because I think, a job search is difficult enough, but especially if you're sort of working uphill against imposter syndrome and some of those feelings, how can it hold you back?
So it can hold you back in all phases of the job search. So I start first and foremost with when you're starting to think about what type of roles you believe you qualify for. And oftentimes when you have imposter syndrome, you believe that you don't have any qualifications. So you may limit your options relative to stretch opportunities or opportunities that may be much more aspirational because you don't think that you, again, deserve to have that opportunity, or you believe that if you find that opportunity, then you will not necessarily be able to fill it and be successful. And so from the outset, you may then, as I talk about often, play small and say, well, maybe I just want a lateral move, or maybe I'll take a step back because I'm not really ready for that next leadership role or that promotion. And so from that outset, you then start to really think through the process of writing the resume. And in the resume, when you struggle with imposter syndrome, you may not be able to fully articulate your accomplishments, your skills, your strengths. You have difficulty feeling like you have a way to represent all your particular successes. So the resume is then impacted because it does not fully reflect what you actually have achieved. And then we go to the point of going on interviews. So during an interview, when we talk about providing success stories, providing opportunities to talk about why you're a best fit candidate, individuals with imposter syndrome will struggle because, again, if that thought in their mind is, well, I don't really have any skills or competencies, I was just lucky to have this current job, they find it very challenging to really talk through and honor the actual achievements that they were able to make based on their skills, based on their talents. And then networking tends to be a challenge because people with imposter syndrome will say, well, I really don't want to network because networking is a triggering situation for me because I then have to talk about who I am and I don't believe that I have much to say. And then finally, at the time of job offer, if you're at a negotiation stage, you may be less inclined to negotiate, feeling like I'm just happy to have a job and I don't want to be exposed. And if I ask for something more, then they will see if I can't fulfill the role, they will see that I actually I don't deserve that role. So when we think about it, you can see from the outset all the way through, accepting a role, it has severe consequences.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's an excellent summary of sort of the additional barriers that it could throw up for job seekers. And, and again, before we get there, I just want to remind everyone to please get your questions into the comments because we'll be taking them in just a bit. But before we get there, Richard, can you tell us how people can work to overcome imposter syndrome? Obviously, you're not just going to make wave a wand and make it go away, but there are things you can do to lessen its severity, right?
Right. And so this is an important point as well, because imposter syndrome, because it is not actually a clinical diagnosis, it's not about curing yourself of imposter syndrome. It's about reducing its impact on your functioning. And so when we talk about that, oftentimes another myth is, well, imposter syndrome can't be reduced, or imposter syndrome is actually a good thing to have. And those are all myths because those with imposter syndrome suffer, oftentimes, unfortunately, suffer in silence. They have increased anxiety. They, again, may not necessarily pursue the opportunities that may make them more satisfied in their careers. And so in our book, we talk about a strategy that really works you through how to overcome imposter syndrome. And so it's this 3-phase, 9-step model that we talk about, which is called Clarify, Create, and Choose, which really goes through the steps of it. And some of the primary aspects of the model that I think are very relevant to a job search and career advancement is this notion of a narrative. That if you have oftentimes someone with imposter syndrome have an inaccurate, false narrative of who they are. So again, they believe that the only reason they are successful is because of luck. They don't believe they have skills. They don't believe that they have the actual talents to move forward. So targeting first and foremost your narrative. So in this first area of Clarify, we talk about your origin story, how it may have come about, your triggers, new situations, new environments may be triggering for you, and understanding what that means for imposter syndrome. This question in this last phase of that, last step of that phase, the narrative, really developing a positive, more accurate narrative really bolsters your ability to know and understand that this is not me puffing myself up. These are actually legitimate accomplishments. So being able to expand and what we call thicken the narrative rather than a thin narrative. The other piece of this is what we call in the next phase, speak your truth, where you're able to fully articulate your strengths. You're really able to articulate all your achievements. And then you're able to silence what we call automatic negative thoughts. So those thoughts that prevent you from moving forward, those thoughts that say, I'm not good enough, those thoughts that say everyone thinks that I don't know what I'm talking about and I'm not competent, they tend to be what sustains imposter syndrome. So targeting those automatic negative thoughts and saying, well, what is the evidence of that? What is the proof of it? And oftentimes being able to neutralize it and recognize that at the end of the day, they're not accurate. They're just thoughts. They're not a reflection of who you actually are. And so changing those thoughts and neutralizing them help you to, again, overcome imposter syndrome. And then the last key pieces that we talk about are self-care, being able to not overwork, and finding a dream team for yourself, finding support. Oftentimes people with imposter syndrome tend to suffer in silence because they're ashamed of talking about the experience. But having a dream team of support, including mentors, including imposter experts, including action planners, grounders, making sure that you have the support you need to counter some of these imposter syndrome narratives that are developed and these triggers that sustain it, as well as the ants, will go a long way in helping to reduce the power of the imposter syndrome. So it's not that you won't be triggered or that the imposter syndrome won't be activated. It will be that you will now have the tools to say, oh, I understand what's happening now. It's my imposter syndrome being activated. Now I'm going to move forward and not let it derail me.
Yeah, I think those are really fantastic sort of tools that people can keep in their back pocket. And we actually have a comment. We have a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to get to those. And we have a comment here from Elizabeth that I picked up on that basically said, it doesn't help when you get rejected from jobs or you don't hear back from job interviews. And I guess with that, is it just about sort of making sure you have all of those little pieces put together during your job search to sort of fight back against that? Because I assume rejection from job offers or rejections from or not even hearing back after interviews, that's all basically things that your subconscious can use as evidence to say you're not good enough, right?
Right. Because oftentimes when you have imposter syndrome, you're looking for cues in the environment to confirm that. And so the job search tends to be one of the most triggering, aspects for imposter syndrome, because it's saying the only time you will feel that you're successful in a job search is when you get a job. And so a lot of the time it is about rejection. It's about non-response. This is where being able to set that plan of action, understanding that you have the skill sets, you have the actual talents to get the job. This is where your dream team comes in, where you say, I'm really feeling frustrated by some of these rejections. And your grounder will say, well, it's not necessarily only about you. And there may be other reasons that you're not landing, right? So let's talk about that. So maybe they had an internal candidate. Maybe the story that you told may not have fit in that way. I've been in this world of career services for over 20 some odd years. And I oftentimes talk about the fact that when you're in a job search, you want to understand that a good deal of the time you will feel like you're not successful, but understanding that each small step is making progress towards that ultimate accomplishment, which is landing the job. So the more you can confirm some of that messaging and the more you can be prepared for that, the more you can ward off the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. And we have a question here from Devanj, who basically says, would you say imposter syndrome affects students too? There are so many students graduating out there not able to articulate what they're good at because they feel that they're new at things.
Right. So I will definitely say that imposter syndrome affects students in a variety of ways. Oftentimes students with imposter syndrome will be less engaged around even the job search process, because again, they may feel like they don't have skills. So they don't show up to the career center. They don't go to the career fairs. They may feel less inclined to be able to believe that they can transition outside of once they graduate. And so there's this balancing act, right? So in talking about being a new professional, recognizing that you will not have all the skills you need after graduation and you land in a role. But so it's all right. So that's not imposter syndrome. If you don't know how to do certain things and you feel anxious about that piece of it may be legitimate in terms of the developmental process. The imposter syndrome comes in when you say, well, I don't even know why they hired me. I know I did well on my internship, but they're going to find out once I'm full time, then I'm not going to be able to do the role. That's where we see the imposter syndrome show up for students as they're thinking about their transition. So either on the internship where they feel like, well, I'm not going to be able to land or do well in an internship, or in that new job as they transition out of school.
Yeah, and we have a comment here from Karen who says, the negative thoughts, imposter syndrome, unemployment, and pandemic, it's a recipe for disaster. And Delora says it reminds her as the perfect storm. So I think that's a good capture of it. And then we have a question here, and it was asked by basically two people, Don and Dave. And they want to know, how do you retain confidence without being viewed as arrogant? And I think that's something some people, they don't want to overcorrect, and they might hold back because they don't want to come off as maybe too showy or too pushy or sort of unpleasant in the workplace.
Sure. So I oftentimes talk about the difference between, say, confidence and assertiveness and, say, arrogance is being able to look at the data and look at the evidence. So if you're talking about doing well in a particular area, then what is the data for that, right? Like if you have strong communications, what have the performance reviews said? If you feel like you're a great leader, what do your colleagues say? So being able to own your accomplishments is not arrogance. It's ultimately being able to say that I'm proud of these things, and you're not necessarily trying to, show them off in people's faces. But I think sometimes, clearly, culturally, it may be difficult because you're not used to owning your accomplishments. It may feel like you are being showy and boastful. But I think there's nothing wrong with really taking the time to reflect upon, well, what do I do well? How do I honor that? How do I continue to leverage that? And how do I recognize that in the ways that I engage with my colleagues and my team members?
Definitely. I think that is a really good point. And we have a question here too about sort of the workplace again. And this one's from Laura. How to deal with a boss who is indirectly cultivating imposter syndrome so as not to increase your salary, especially when clients themselves are expressing that they are more than satisfied with the report conclusion they received. And obviously, we talked about, there are outside forces that can sort of reinforce imposter syndrome. So what happens when you have an authority figure or a manager who basically is that person and that force?
So this is also a wonderful question, and something that comes up a great deal of the time. We actually did a TEDx talk where we talked about toxic cultures and imposter sustaining workplaces and bosses. And it's to first and foremost recognize that it's the boss and not your issue. Because if you're getting good feedback from clients, if you're getting good feedback from colleagues, then it's understanding that you want to figure out how to manage up with this particular boss. Like, what is driving this type of behavior? And it's not necessarily for you to be, the boss's therapist, but to say, okay, in these interactions, what do I anticipate? What are the expectations? And how do we, again, quantify and qualify some of the things that they might wish that I do? Not being perfect, right? Because some of the toxicities may be a perfectionistic boss that says, oh, you have to be perfect. If not, then I'm not going to give you praise. But understanding first and foremost that it may be their issue more so than you doing anything wrong, but thinking about what you might need to do to respond to that boss differently, to either anticipate objections, to kind of on the front end talk about what the expectations and the results and outcomes might be, so that you can work through it as you go through the process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we have a question here from Stephen who asked, I feel part of imposter syndrome is culture. As a first generation American and college graduate, I was taught to put my head down and keep your job safe, to be grateful. Do you think that people from underrepresented communities face imposter syndrome differently?
Yes. And so this is a great question. So when we talk about these myths, there's this myth going about that says, well, imposter syndrome is caused by oppression. Imposter syndrome is not caused by oppression, but I will say that oppression can sustain it. So, and that's very different, because this notion that only people who are oppressed have imposter syndrome is a dangerous notion, because it's not accurate. It's not true. Yet the research indicates that those from underrepresented communities tend to have a different experience of imposter syndrome. So it's what we call this double impact of imposter syndrome. So on one end, you internally feel like an imposter and may overwork and feel like you don't have any accomplishments. But then externally, there are cues again in the environment that may be telling you that you're an imposter. So bias, discrimination, sexism, racism, all those types of cues that may then make you feel like, well, I already feel like an imposter, and here and now in the environment, there are signals that are saying to me, well, in fact, you don't belong. And so I think it's also important to recognize when those signals occur and to interpret them not as confirmation that you're an imposter, but that you are experiencing some discriminatory challenges in the environment.
Yeah, I think that's really good points. And in fact, I just had a conversation with someone this week actually about, there are people who are raised often with families who sort of have that mentality. Maybe they were in manufacturing, or they worked in those capacities where it was keep your head down and just do your job and then go home at the end of the day. But, if you're in a different field or that's not the career path you want, that can sort of inhibit you in some ways. So it's really interesting to think about like how you were grown and how you were taught to work. So I think that's a good conversation. And we have a few questions here that are a little bit outside imposter syndrome, but obviously within your wheelhouse, because this is what you do. We have a question here from Terry, who wants to know if it's true what they say that it's easier to get a job when you have a job. And a lot of people, they'll say, if you have a job even somewhere, you'll get a leg up in the hiring process because it shows that you're active somewhere and someone else wanted to hire you.
So one of the things that I will say to this, and unfortunately, some aspects of that are true, so I won't say it as an absolute, but no question, especially during the economic downturn in 2008, this was something that I witnessed, where individuals who were not working somehow or another were perceived as less than and more suspect rather than someone who was working. And I do think in going through and being someone who was a hiring manager and going through a variety of searches and working as a chief diversity officer and managing searches, that it does still tend to come up that people will start to question, well, why is this person not working? I oftentimes tell clients that when people are reading your story, reading the resume, or thinking about your background, they're typically, unfortunately, trying to read through and have generally negative assumptions, right? Like if there's a gap, they're not going to say, oh, maybe they were taking a break or what have you. They then start to say, well, what was happening here, and why should I take a chance on this person? So it is something societally that we still face. I think this is why it's so crucial to continue to network, to really build these ties for people who can boost your story, can serve as advocates for you as you go through this process, so that it's not just a piece of paper representing you, that you have people in different organizations that can tell the story in the ways that honors your actual journey.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, one thing I've been telling people too about this is that things have shifted a lot during the pandemic, especially perceptions by hiring managers about people who have career gaps and things like that. So it would be interesting to sort of poll hiring managers to say, hey, how do you feel about people who are unemployed versus currently employed? And so hopefully someone can do that research somewhere along the line.
Yeah, it's definitely needed.
And we have a question here from Karen who wants to talk about the personality assessments that people get when they're applying for jobs or even when they're being interviewed. And there's obviously a big spectrum of these tests, from gamification where you play games to where you're taking almost like an intelligence test. So what can you tell people about the use of these tests during the hiring process, and how should they approach them? Because obviously they get really anxious. And I heard from someone not too long ago who took one of those like intelligence-y tests where it's not an IQ test, but that's how it's almost sold at. And they really felt deflated after they took it because they didn't get the job.
Right. And part of what happens, and I think companies sometimes get really caught up in like the latest trends or what have you. And I'm always asking companies to definitely think about, if you're providing or giving out some level of assessment, how much is it tied to the actual job, the actual functions of the job, the actual ability to be successful on the job? It's very dangerous when you start using personality assessments to really figure out, is someone going to be a good fit? Because the mix can be certainly different, and recognizing what you may want may not emerge through some of those. So if you're asked to take some of the gamification ones, when they're looking for problem solving skills or what have you, and that's an aspect of the job, I get. But if you're taking something that's more like an intelligence-y test, then the question becomes, well, what is the purpose of it, and how does it actually reflect your ability to function in the role? And again, I know this will be a broken record. This is why I go back to having someone represent you that says, look, they do good work no matter what that test is saying. There's someone who delivers. I've seen, the caliber of their work. So this is someone that I think will be a good addition to the team, rather than getting caught up in some of these HR trends that reflect not necessarily accurately who might be a best fit candidate for the role versus not. Because oftentimes when you ask some of these individual, companies why they're providing some of these tests, they don't give legitimate, quantifiable reasons as to why that is. It just seems like something that they feel like is the thing to do. So that's, to be dangerous. So I can definitely appreciate you being frustrated by it, but it's not a reflection of you being a good candidate or not.
Definitely, yeah. And in fact, one of those tests, and I forget the name of it, but I try and take them when I can or when I come across them. And the one was, it literally asks you to find the measurement of one side of a pyramid. And I was thinking, in all of my years of over a decade of professional experience, I was never told you have to find the measurement of this triangle. So I think those are good points.
You can't do your job.
Yeah, exactly. And we have a comment here from Jeanette. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, and it goes to the idea of after an interview, when you don't get feedback or you don't really get anything other than a rejection, you're left wondering why. And she says she wishes people would at least give feedback on interviews so you know what to fix. And do you have any suggestions for people who maybe want that feedback and how they can ask for it and maybe get it?
So again, broken record, if you have an inside person that can then say, well, this is what I've heard, that is where you are able to really obtain some of that information. So I'll be honest and I'll be quite frank. Many companies are afraid to give the feedback because of any legal constraints or legal concerns. So they are less inclined to say, well, you could do this better, or we thought this. And because some of it may be left to subjectivity, which can open them up in their beliefs. Like their counsel will always err on the side of being conservative and not deal with any of that. But if you have someone who is your booster and your advocate, they can say to you, and these have been, many examples that I've had where people will say, oh yeah, I spoke to this friend of mine. They said, this is the reason that they went in this direction versus that direction. Here's what I can do a little bit better. So having that ally, having that advocate is the best way for you to find out that information, because otherwise companies are loath to provide it for fear of what legal ramifications may occur because of it.
Yeah. And we have a question here too, from Kelly, who says, if you only have one job for over 30 years, How do you avoid imposter syndrome? And I think especially now with the current job market, a lot of people move around every few years, and there's people who, when they have a long tenure at a job, they say, okay, is there something wrong with me? Why am I not going somewhere else? So for people who have that long tenure, or maybe they've been at a place for 7, 8 years, what is your advice to them?
So I always say to take a inventory every year and say, what is it that I am contributing? How am I growing? How am I learning? How am I meeting some of the goals that I have for myself? And being able to be honest with that. For some people, the primary goal may be just safety, right? If they feel like they've hit a wall and are bored at their job, but they really want something that is stable, that may be what causes them to stay. And that's where the imposter syndrome comes in, right? Where if you feel like, well, I've been here so long, I don't think I'll have any value anywhere else because I'm just lucky to have this job, that may be the imposter syndrome being activated. But I say every year taking an inventory of saying, well, what do I have left to do here? What are the new challenges? What gets me excited? What keeps me motivated? And quite frankly, for some people who have a long tenure, there may be some things that are still keeping them motivated and excited, and it may be mission driven, based on the organization's goals and objectives. So as long as you're honest in doing that inventory, it then allows you to know, well, what is it that may be keeping me back if I feel like I'm no longer motivated, I'm no longer actually feeling like there's something left for me to do here in terms of growth and learning.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And, I think our members got so much out of this conversation. I saw someone who said, your stuff. So they got a lot out of it.
I appreciate that.
But yeah, so thank you so much for joining us, Richard. It's been great having you.
It's a pleasure, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and we obviously have been flashing Richard's profile at the bottom of the screen throughout, the conversation. So please make sure that you follow him. And then obviously his book is Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life. And I'll actually be putting it into the comments right now. So there you go. And then, obviously, we are here every week with our show, but there's always some wonderful stuff happening on this page. So the LinkedIn news page is always giving you wonderful content. And on Monday, it is no different because we have my colleague, Nina Melendez, will be covering the battle over power. What's the best way to supply power to the US? Nina will have a conversation with 2 experts breaking down different methods to create energy like nuclear, solar, and wind. That's Monday at noon Eastern time. And like I said, I'm back here every Friday having these conversations. And this coming Friday, I will have a conversation with a career strategist and HR expert, Sonal Ball. She'll be joining us all the way from Europe. So be sure to tune into that. My producers will be putting the RSVP link into the comments and also into the post above. So be sure to RSVP for that and join us on Friday. And as I say every week, please take care of yourself. Please pay attention to your local health guidelines. It's obviously a very tricky time around the world in many locations for people, especially in India and Brazil. So take care of yourself. You could only be a good candidate. You could only get a job if you're healthy and well enough to do so. So until next time, best of luck.